December 1769. Deep in the Kentucky wilderness, a man crouches in the canebrake and realizes in the space of a breath that he is surrounded. He is not alone out here. He never thought he was. But now the Shawnee warriors closing around him are close enough to touch. They take his horse, 6 months of work, gone in a moment. They look at him the way men look at someone who has walked into a room he has no business being in. They are not wrong. What do you do in that moment? 1,000 miles from anything that would call itself civilization. No one is coming for you, and the men holding you are not the savages the stories told you about. They are something more unsettling than that. This is the story of Daniel Boone, not the legend, the man who kept coming back anyway. Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. The story of Daniel Boone is one of the most told in American history, and one of the most misunderstood. We're going to strip away the coonskin mythology and look at the documented record of a man who was more complicated, more remarkable, and more human than the legend ever allowed. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Every new subscriber helps us keep telling these stories, and we want to know, who do you think is the most mythologized figure in American frontier history? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. Now, let us begin. The year is 1763. The French and Indian War has just ended, and the British Empire finds itself in possession of a problem it does not entirely know how to solve. 7 years of conflict, fought in the forests and river valleys of North America, on the frozen lakes of upstate New York, in the swamps of the Ohio country, and in the formal siege lines outside Quebec, has pushed France out of the continent and handed Britain an enormous swath of territory stretching from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River. The colonists who had bled and fought alongside British regulars expected a reward. They had been promised the West. They had been shown maps. They had been told that the lands beyond the mountains were rich beyond imagining, that a man with strong hands and a willingness to work could carve out something real in those valleys. What they got instead was a line on a map. On October 7th, 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in language that was firm, clear, and immediately controversial. It declared that no British subject was permitted to settle or purchase lands west of the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. The territory beyond that ridge, the vast interior of the continent, was to remain Indian land, at least for now. The Crown wanted to stabilize its new empire, avoid further expensive Indian wars, and bring the colonial frontiersmen to heel before they sparked another conflict that London would have to pay for. The frontiersmen had other plans. To understand Daniel Boone's story, you have to understand the world he grew up in, and the world he chose to push past. He was born on November 2nd, 1734, in Berks County, Pennsylvania, the 6th of 11 children of Squire and Sarah Morgan Boone. The family was Quaker, or at least nominally so. Squire Boone was eventually expelled from the Quaker meeting for allowing 2 of his older children to marry outside the faith. It was not a household that bent easily to institutional authority. That stubbornness would prove hereditary. The Boones were part of a tide. Tens of thousands of families, Scots, Irish, English, German, were moving south and west in these years, pouring down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and on into the Carolinas. The road was not a road in any formal sense. It was a widened trace, a rutted track through the rolling hills of the interior, used so heavily by wagons and livestock that it became self-defining. You followed it because others had followed it. You stopped where others had stopped, along creek banks and at the edges of clearings where the soil looked dark and the grass grew thick. You built what you could and hoped the next family came far enough to be neighbors, but not so close as to crowd you. Daniel came of age in this world. He learned to read and write, but barely. His surviving letters are phonetic, idiosyncratic, and entirely functional. What he learned fluently, almost from birth, was the forest. By his early 20s, Boone was what the colonists called a long hunter, a man who departed in the fall and did not return until spring, ranging far into the wilderness on hunting expeditions that could last 6 months or more. These were not casual hunting trips. They were sustained wilderness operations requiring an intimate knowledge of animal behavior, terrain, weather, and the complex network of native trade routes and hunting grounds that crisscrossed the interior. A long hunter who misread a river crossing drowned. A long hunter who misjudged a storm froze. A long hunter who wandered into the wrong territory at the wrong time simply disappeared, and his family spent years wondering. A long hunter who got it right came home with furs and hides worth significant money and knowledge worth more. Boone got it right. Repeatedly, he served as a wagoner during Braddock's disastrous campaign in 1755, during the French and Indian War, and it was there, in the chaos and carnage of that defeated British column ambushed on the Monongahela River, cut to pieces by French allied warriors firing from cover into soldiers trained to fight in open fields, that he first heard detailed accounts of the country beyond the Appalachians. A man named John Finley, who had traveled deep into the Kentucky country before the war, described a land of almost unimaginable richness, vast meadows of bluegrass stretching to the horizon, salt licks drawing buffalo in herds so large the ground shook, rivers clear and cold and thick with fish. Boone was 20 years old, driving a supply wagon through a disaster. He listened to every word. He spent the next decade building his reputation as a hunter, his knowledge of the backcountry, and his circle of trusted companions. He also built a family. He and his wife, Rebecca Bryan, had been married in 1756, and children followed in regular succession. Rebecca Boone deserves more than a passing mention here because the historical record, sparse as it is on her inner life, makes certain things undeniable. She was capable, self-sufficient, and possessed of a toughness that the mythology of the frontier hero consistently fails to credit. When Daniel was away, and he was away often, sometimes for years at a stretch, the farm ran because she ran it. The children were fed and clothed and disciplined because she fed and clothed and disciplined them. The neighbors respected her because she had earned their respect independently, not as a reflection of her husband's fame. That is simply what the record shows. By the mid-1760s, Boone was feeling the pressure that drove so many frontiersmen westward: debt. He was a gifted hunter, but a poor businessman, and the financial obligations accumulated in the way they tend to for men whose skills are suited to one economy and whose lives are lived in another. Land speculation, borrowed horses, unpaid taxes, the accumulated weight of a family that needed more than the Yadkin Valley could easily provide. Kentucky, as he had heard described by Finley and others, represented an escape from all of it. Rich land, game in abundance, a fresh start in territory that had not yet been claimed, surveyed, and carved into legal parcels by men with better lawyers. There was only one problem: the Proclamation Line. In the spring of 1769, Daniel Boone did what frontier colonists all along the Appalachians were doing in defiance of royal decree. He crossed the mountains anyway. His party was small: himself, his brother-in-law John Stewart, a friend named Joseph Holden, James Mooney, and William Cool, and, crucially, John Finley, The man who had first described Kentucky to Boone on that battlefield 14 years before, who had been living with the image of those meadows and salt licks in his head ever since, and who had finally found a man willing to go back with him. 6 men. They moved through the Cumberland Gap, a natural pass in the Appalachians that would become, in the coming decades, the keyhole through which tens of thousands of settlers would pour into the interior. Boone had scouted the approaches before. He knew the route. What he found on the other side would change American history. Kentucky in 1769 was not empty. Let us be absolutely clear about this, because later mythology, and later land law, would work very hard to pretend otherwise. The Shawnee hunted there seasonally and considered it part of their territory. The Cherokee had claims extending from the south. The Chickasaw used the western reaches. Various other nations moved through on trade and war parties. Kentucky was contested, complex, and densely significant in the political geography of native North America. It was not a wilderness in the sense of an uninhabited place. It was a wilderness in the older sense, a place of wildness, of non-European order, of laws and boundaries and sovereignties that English colonists had no framework for recognizing, and therefore a great deal of motivation not to acknowledge. Boone knew people were there. He had learned enough from Finley and from his own experience to understand that the country he was entering was not his by right of prior absence. He went anyway. The pull of what Finley had described, and what Boone had glimpsed in his own earlier excursions near the mountain passes, was stronger than the caution. And Kentucky was everything Finley had promised. The meadows were real. The bluegrass rolling across the gentle hills south of the Ohio River, fed by limestone-rich springs, grew in a way that made a man from the scraped-over Piedmont soils of North Carolina almost physically dizzy. The salt licks were real, and they drew buffalo in numbers Boone had never seen. Vast, dark, slow-moving aggregations of animals that covered entire hillsides, that left the ground around the licks churned to mud for acres in every direction, that represented a wealth of meat and hide almost incomprehensible to a man who had spent his adult life hunting the comparatively depleted forests of the Carolina backcountry. He was a gifted hunter operating in a hunter's paradise, and for months the expedition was exactly what he had hoped. Then, in December of 1769, the Shawnee arrived. A war party found Boone and John Stuart separated from the rest of their group and surrounded them before either man had time to react. The Shawnee chief leading the party, his name was not recorded by the colonists, which is itself a telling omission, addressed them in a mixture of trade English and gesture that left no room for misunderstanding. He pointed to their horses, loaded with months of accumulated pelts and hides. He pointed to the direction from which they had come. He spoke words that Boone understood clearly enough. "You have what belongs to us. Now go." They took the horses. They took every fur Boone and Stuart had accumulated. They took the rifles, the powder, the tools, everything that represented 6 months of dangerous, skilled, exhausting work in one of the most demanding environments in North America. And then, in a gesture that would haunt Boone for the rest of his life, because it forced him to confront what he already knew, they let him and Stuart go. Not out of weakness, out of something more complicated than that. The Shawnee could have killed them. There was no colonial authority within several hundred miles that would have known or cared, but killing them was not the point. The point was the message, and the message was this: this land is ours. We know you are here, and we are choosing to send you home rather than leave your bones for the crows. Leave. Do not come back. Most men would have gone home. Boone did not go home. He sent the rest of the party back to the settlements. He kept John Stewart with him. He continued exploring. What followed over the next 2 years was one of the most remarkable sustained wilderness survival episodes in the colonial record. Stewart was killed, almost certainly by Shawnee, though the circumstances were never fully established, and his body was not found for years, discovered eventually inside a hollow sycamore tree with a splintered bone lodged in his decayed wrist, the grim archaeology of a violent and solitary end. Boone's brother Squire arrived from North Carolina with fresh horses and supplies, then returned to gather more. And then, in the spring and summer of 1770, a period that Boone later described with what sounds almost like reverence in the accounts that have survived him, Daniel Boone was completely alone in Kentucky. Not temporarily alone, not alone except for a partner. Completely, utterly alone. The only English-speaking human being in a territory the size of several European countries, surrounded by people who had every reason to kill him and had already demonstrated the restraint not to, wandering a landscape that had never been formally mapped and that he was committing to memory with the obsessive, loving attention of a man who understood that this knowledge was the only thing standing between him and death. He carved his name into a beech tree sometime during those months. D. Boone silled a bar on tree in the year 1760, the inscription read. The date almost certainly wrong, the spelling characteristically Boone's, the impulse to mark his presence in that enormous silence deeply, humanly understandable. He was here. He existed. Whatever happened next, he had been in this place. He survived by hunting. He was, after all, among the finest hunters in the colonies. He survived by moving constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice if he could avoid it, never building a fire large enough to be seen from a distance, reading the landscape for signs of movement, the way other men read words on a page. He survived by an act of sustained, daily, complete attention to his environment that most people in the 21st century cannot easily imagine. A state of alertness maintained not for hours but for months, where every sound had a meaning and every unexplained absence of sound had a meaning, and getting the meaning wrong meant not waking up the next morning. When Squire returned with fresh horses, Boone was alive, unsurprisingly lean, and in possession of a knowledge of Kentucky's geography that no other living European could match. He began immediately planning to go back again. The Transylvania Company was a real estate venture with grandiose ambitions and significant legal problems. Founded by North Carolina Judge Richard Henderson in 1774, it aimed to purchase an enormous swath of land directly from the Cherokee and establish an independent proprietary colony west of the Appalachians, a colony Henderson intended to name Transylvania and to govern as a private fief. The plan was, from a legal standpoint, almost certainly invalid. The Proclamation of 1763 had not been repealed. Virginia and North Carolina both claimed the territory in question. The legality of private land purchases from native nations, bypassing colonial governments entirely, had no real precedent in English law. And the war that was beginning to take shape between the colonies and Britain made the entire enterprise even more legally precarious. Henderson didn't care, or rather, he cared about the opportunity more than the obstacles. He was a man of enormous confidence and limited scruple, and he had found the perfect instrument for his ambitions: Daniel Boone. The two men had known each other for years. Boone had hunted on Henderson's behalf, scouted territory Henderson was interested in, and developed the kind of relationship that existed between a wealthy speculator and a gifted frontiersman who needed the speculator's backing. Henderson offered Boone something concrete, a role in the enterprise that would make Boone the first man through the Cumberland Gap with an authorized party, the leader of the settlement that would anchor Henderson's colony, and, crucially, a share of the land that might finally settle his chronic financial problems. In March 1775, Boone led a party of approximately 30 axemen from the Holston River settlements in southwestern Virginia into Kentucky. Their assignment was to cut a road, what would become known as the Wilderness Road, through the Cumberland Gap and onto a site on the Kentucky River that Henderson had chosen for the main settlement. The work was brutal and the timeline unforgiving. Spring in the Appalachians meant rain and mud and swollen creek crossings that could strand a party for days. The terrain through the gap itself was not simply steep. It was a series of steep, each one followed by another, with narrow passages where a loaded pack horse could barely turn around and where a rockfall from above could take a man without warning. And they were not alone in these mountains. The Cherokee were watching. The Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, the deal Henderson had negotiated with certain Cherokee leaders in March of 1775, was already controversial within the Cherokee Nation. Chief Dragging Canoe had been present at the negotiations and had refused to sign, reportedly telling Henderson and Boone directly that the land was dark and bloody, that the path they were about to walk would be hard, and that he would not be responsible for what waited for them at the end of it. He was not making a vague threat. He was being specific. And he was right. On the night of March 24th, 1775, while the party was camped near a creek in what is now southeastern Kentucky, a group of Cherokee warriors opened fire on the camp in the darkness. 2 men were killed. Captain William Twetty, shot through both knees and dead within days, and his enslaved servant, a man whose name the historical record preserves only as Sam, a reminder of how selectively the colonial frontier chose which deaths to document. Another man, Felix Walker, was badly wounded but survived. The rest of the camp scattered into the darkness. Boone held them together in the morning. This is documented. When the sun came up and the survivors gathered, there were men who wanted to turn back, and they were not unreasonable in wanting that. They were in the mountains, 2 men down, facing a native resistance that had just demonstrated both its willingness to act and its accuracy in the dark. Going back was not cowardice. It was common sense. Boone's argument, made not in a speech, not in any formal way, but in the manner of a man who simply communicated his intention and expected others to recognize that it was correct, was essentially this: going back was also dangerous, and the land ahead was what they had come for. He sent word back to settlers who were following behind, warning of the danger. Several of those parties turned around, others pressed on, and Boone led his diminished group forward through the gap and into Kentucky. They reached the Kentucky River. They began building. The settlement they established was called Boonesboro, and in April 1775, when Henderson himself arrived with additional settlers and supplies and the considerable self-satisfaction of a man whose audacious plan was actually working, it had grown to a collection of rough-hewn cabins surrounded by a partially completed stockade. By any formal architectural standard, it was extremely modest, the kind of construction that a visitor from Philadelphia or Boston would look at and see only the crudeness. By the standard of what it meant, the first English settlement in the interior of the continent, beyond the mountains, in defiance of royal proclamation, in the face of native resistance, on the eve of a revolution that was about to transform everything. It was extraordinary. What happened next would test it to the edge of destruction. The American Revolution transformed the Kentucky frontier in ways that are rarely fully conveyed in standard history courses. The standard narrative of the Revolution is Atlantic, Boston, Philadelphia, Yorktown, Valley Forge. The narrative of the Western frontier during those same years is something different, darker, more personal, less ideological, and in many ways more brutal. The British, pursuing a strategically logical policy, worked to align native nations against the American settlements, pushing into their territories. This was not the cynical manipulation it is sometimes portrayed as. Native nations had genuine, documented, legitimate reasons to oppose the American settlements. Those settlements were taking their land. The British alliance offered resources, recognition, and an opportunity to stop the encroachment before it became irreversible. The Shawnee, who had watched Kentucky fill with long hunters and then settlers in less than a decade, who had already lost significant hunting ground and understood clearly where the trajectory was heading, became significant players in this alliance. For the settlers at Boonesboro and the handful of other Kentucky stations, Harrodsburg, Logan's Fort, smaller clusters of cabins along the river valleys, the Revolution was not primarily a political or ideological event. It was not about taxation or representation or the rights of Englishmen. It was a survival crisis, played out in ambushes on forest paths, in night raids on isolated cabins, in the endless grinding arithmetic of who was still alive at the end of each season and who was not. Boone had already buried a son before any of this began. James Boone, his eldest, was 17 years old in October 1773 when a mixed party of Cherokee and Shawnee warriors attacked the rear of a supply column Boone was leading through the mountains. James was captured along with several others. What happened to him afterward is documented in accounts that were written down later, filtered through grief and time, and they are not accounts that bear easy reading. He was tortured. He begged for his life. He died slowly, within earshot of the main column, close enough that his father may have been able to hear him. Boone turned the party around. He went back to North Carolina. He grieved his son, or at least he did whatever it was that Daniel Boone did with grief. Suppressed it, moved it aside, continued to function, which was the only option the frontier allowed. And less than 2 years later, he was back. The Revolutionary War years in Kentucky ran roughly from 1776 through 1782, and what they looked like on the ground was a sustained, irregular, asymmetric conflict that the settlers were losing for most of it. The raids came without warning and without mercy. Cabins burned in the night. Livestock was driven off. Children were taken. Some were ransomed later. Some were adopted into native families and never came back, and some simply vanished from the historical record. The men who stood watches in the blockhouses of Boonesboro and Harrodsburg and Logan's Fort knew they were holding a perimeter that was shrinking with every year, and they held it anyway, because retreat meant abandoning everything they had built and everything they had lost in the building. It was in the middle of this sustained crisis, the winter of 1777 into 1778, a period Kentucky settlers called the Year of the Bloody Sevens, that Boone made the decision that would define how history judged him. In February 1778, he was leading a party of about 30 men to the Blue Licks, salt works on the Licking River. Salt was not a luxury on the frontier. It was a preservation technology, the only practical way to keep meat through the winter. The Blue Licks were one of the few reliable sources within range of the Kentucky settlements, and the work of boiling down the saline water into usable salt required men and time and a fixed location. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of situation that made a frontier party vulnerable. The Shawnee War Party that found them numbered over 100, possibly closer to 150. They had been sent south from the Shawnee towns in Ohio by the British Allied war chief Blackfish with a specific purpose: to take the Kentucky settlements before spring brought more settlers and more militia south across the Ohio. Boone looked at the numbers. He looked at his 30 men, most of them unarmed, or carrying only the tools of salt-making rather than the equipment of combat. He made a calculation. He surrendered. Not just himself, he convinced his entire party to lay down their arms. 27 men. He told them it was the only way to keep them alive, and he was almost certainly right. A fight against those numbers, in those circumstances, would have produced one outcome, and it was not survival. The Shawnee took them north, into Ohio, into the Shawnee towns, and into a situation that no biography of Daniel Boone has ever fully explained. Blackfish was a Shawnee war chief of considerable political sophistication and personal authority. He had been watching the Kentucky settlements for years, watching them grow, watching them absorb the land that the Shawnee had hunted and governed for generations, watching the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals and the steady flood of settlers through the Cumberland Gap, with the particular attention of a man who understands that he is witnessing something that cannot be stopped by half measures. He was not a savage. He was a leader of his people in the most complete sense of the word, operating in a political environment of extraordinary complexity, balancing the demands of the British alliance, the internal politics of the Shawnee Confederacy, the needs of his own village and family, and the inexorable pressure of American expansion, with a degree of strategic clarity that his colonial opponents consistently underestimated. When Blackfish examined the prisoners taken at the Blue Licks, he made a decision that surprised the settlers then and has puzzled historians since. He singled out Daniel Boone. The Shawnee had a practice of adoption, of taking captives, particularly from enemy groups, and incorporating them into the tribe as replacements for members who had been killed. It was not a casual gesture. Adoption meant a genuine change in status, a genuine incorporation into Shawnee family and community life. The adopted person was expected to take on Shawnee identity, to participate in Shawnee daily life, to become, in the most serious possible sense, one of the people. Blackfish adopted Boone as his son. He gave him the name Sheltawee, Big Turtle. What followed was several months in which Daniel Boone lived as a Shawnee man in the Shawnee town of Chillicothe in present-day Ohio, and the historical record of this period is simultaneously well documented in its broad outlines and deeply uncertain in its meaning. We know he was there. We know he participated in Shawnee hunts, that he spoke the language well enough to communicate meaningfully, that he was treated, by all contemporary accounts, as a genuine member of Blackfish's family rather than as a prisoner. We know that other American captives from the Blue Licks Party were nearby, and that Boone's situation was markedly different from theirs. We know that Blackfish appears to have genuinely felt the warmth toward Boone that adoption implied. What we do not know, what the historical record cannot tell us, and what Boone himself never fully explained, is what he felt during those months. Whether the relationship with Blackfish was entirely strategic on Boone's part, a performance of acceptance designed to keep him alive until an opportunity for escape appeared. Whether he felt something genuine, respect, affection, the complicated bond that can develop between people thrown together by circumstance. Whether he lived with the knowledge of what he planned to do and felt in those moments of Shawnee family life, something that could only be called guilt. What we know is what he did. He gathered information. He learned, through the conversations and movements of Shawnee life around him, that a major military expedition against Boonesboro was being planned. Blackfish was assembling a large force, warriors, British Rangers, considerable resources, for an assault intended to finish the Kentucky settlements before they could be reinforced by the spring migration of new settlers from the east. This was not rumor. This was operational planning happening around Boone in the normal course of Shawnee military preparation, because Boone was, by then, supposed to be one of them. He had been adopted. He was Sheltowee. He was not supposed to carry this information back to his enemies. In the night of June 16, 1778, Daniel Boone slipped out of the Shawnee town and ran. What came next is one of the most remarkable athletic and wilderness performances in the documentary record of the frontier. He ran and walked and ran again, approximately 160 miles through the Ohio wilderness in roughly 4 days, traveling without food for most of the journey, crossing the Ohio River by finding a canoe and paddling across alone, moving through country where Shawnee pursuit was a constant possibility, navigating by the stars and by the woodsman's instinct that had been developing in him for 43 years. He arrived at Boonesboro on June 20, 1778. He was thin, exhausted, and carrying the most important intelligence the settlement had ever received. An attack was coming. They had, at most, a few weeks. He immediately began improving the fort's defenses, which were, in the understated language of frontier accounts, not in good shape. Boonesboro had been built in 1775 and had been maintained only sporadically since. The stockade walls had gaps. The blockhouses needed reinforcement. The well inside the perimeter was inadequate for a prolonged siege. Boone drove the work with the urgency of a man who had sat across the fire from the man planning to attack them and knew exactly how serious the threat was. Blackfish arrived outside Boonesboro on September 7, 1778. The accounts of what followed over the next 12 days represent some of the most densely documented episodes of the Kentucky frontier, drawing on the later testimony of survivors, the detailed memoir of one of the settlers, and the court-martial proceedings that followed. Let us spend some time with the siege because it is worth understanding in its full complexity. Blackfish had a force that contemporary accounts place at between 300 and 400 warriors, accompanied by a small number of French-Canadian Rangers operating under British authority. The settlement held at that moment somewhere between 30 and 60 men capable of bearing arms. The exact number fluctuated as men were away hunting or working in the fields, plus women and older children who could load weapons, carry water, and perform the 1,000 tasks of a fortification under siege. It was, by any military calculus, a wildly unequal contest. Blackfish did not immediately attack. Instead, he sent a message requesting to meet with Boone. This is one of those moments in history where you can feel the strangeness of the situation pressing against the ordinary language used to describe it. The man outside the walls had adopted Boone as his son. He had given him a name. He had hunted with him, eaten with him, introduced him to the full texture of Shawnee life. And Boone had taken all of that and run, carrying information that would be used against the people who had welcomed him. Now they were facing each other across a stockade wall, and Blackfish was asking to talk. Boone went out. Under a white flag, in view of both parties, he met with Blackfish in the open ground between the walls and the tree line. The negotiations lasted 3 days. Blackfish presented his terms. The settlers would surrender to British authority. They would be taken north as prisoners. They would be guaranteed their safety and their lives. He argued the case with what the settler accounts describe as both firmness and genuine courtesy. He was not threatening, not blustering. He was making what he considered a reasonable offer. He was, after all, their superior force. He was, after all, their former family. Boone stalled. He negotiated with all the skill of a man who had spent decades reading situations and people, who had learned from Shawnee negotiators how to be both engaged and uncommitted, who understood that every day of delay was a day in which help might arrive, in which the weather might shift, in which Blackfish's force, which needed to feed itself in the field, might begin to feel the pressure of time. He told Blackfish the settlers would consider the terms. He asked for time to consult with them. He went back inside the walls and told his people to work faster on the defenses. The talks produced one genuinely strange moment that the historical record preserves with unusual clarity. Blackfish proposed a formal treaty. The settlers would place their hands on an agreement, and the ceremony would seal their surrender. Boone agreed to the ceremony. When the warriors and settlers came together for the handshake that was meant to ratify the surrender, the Shawnee seized the settlers' arms. Whether this was a planned betrayal or a spontaneous reaction to perceived threat remains unclear, and a brief, violent struggle broke out in the open ground. Boone and the other settlers broke away and ran for the gates. Shooting started. The formal siege began. For the next 9 days, Blackfish's force fired on the fort, attempted to dig a tunnel under the walls to plant a charge that would breach them, and pressed the perimeter at multiple points. The tunnel was discovered. The settlers could see the fresh earth appearing closer each day and eventually detected its direction. And flooding it or collapsing it became one of the settlement's priorities. Inside the walls, the situation was desperate in the specific, documented ways that siege situations always are. Insufficient water, limited food, exhausted people maintaining watches through the nights, the constant sound of musket fire and the constant knowledge that the walls between them and the outside were not as strong as anyone wished. The women of Boonesboro deserve specific acknowledgement here. The historical record, frustratingly, gives us their actions more clearly than their names in most cases. They loaded weapons. They carried powder and ball. They maintained the water supply under fire. When the situation demanded it, some of them dressed in men's clothing and moved through the fort to create the impression of greater numbers, a documented tactic, not an invented one. They kept the settlement functioning through 9 days of siege with a practical competence that the mythology of the frontier hero focused always on the armed man at the wall, consistently undersells. On September 18, 1778, Blackfish's force withdrew. The reasons are not entirely clear from the documentary record. The tunnel had been flooded and abandoned. The direct assaults had not breached the walls. The British Rangers had apparently grown frustrated with the pace of operations. And the Shawnee were, after all, a fighting force in the field that needed to sustain itself. The logistics of maintaining 400 men outside a fortified position indefinitely were not trivial. Whatever the combination of reasons, they left. Boonesboro had survived. And Daniel Boone, who had lived with the man who led the attack and had carried the intelligence of that attack to the people who defended against it, was now facing a court-martial. The court-martial of Daniel Boone in October 1778 is one of the most revealing episodes in his life, and it is almost never discussed with the seriousness it deserves. Colonel Richard Calloway, who filed the charges, was not simply being petty or jealous, though contemporaries suggest personal animosity between the two men played a role. His charges were specific: that Boone had surrendered the salt makers at the Blue Licks without adequate resistance, that during his time with the Shawnee, he had given information to the British and had collaborated with the enemy, that during the siege negotiations he had agreed to terms that amounted to treason. These were not frivolous charges. Boone had, by objective measure, surrendered 27 armed men to a Shawnee war party without fighting. He had lived with the Shawnee for several months, close enough to Blackfish to be considered his adopted son. And his conduct during the siege negotiations, the deliberate ambiguity, the apparent willingness to discuss surrender, had looked to Callaway and others inside the walls like exactly the kind of double game a man might play if his loyalties were uncertain. The court-martial acquitted him on all charges, and then, in what may be the most pointed commentary on what the community actually thought of the proceedings, promoted him to major. The verdict reflected something important about frontier justice and frontier pragmatism. The men who acquitted Boone were not naive. They had watched him during the siege. They had seen what his intelligence, his negotiating tactics, and his knowledge of the Shawnee had produced, a settlement still standing. You could argue about his methods, about the surrender at the Blue Licks, about the ethics of his months with Blackfish. You could not argue with the walls still being there. Callaway never forgave him. The relationship between the two men remained poisoned until Callaway's death in a Shawnee raid near Boonesboro in the spring of 1780, a bitter end that the historical record notes without comment, leaving the moral weight of it to hang unresolved. Boone remained. He always remained. To understand why the Shawnee fought the way they did, and why the Kentucky frontier was as brutal and sustained and costly as it was, you have to understand the Shawnee Nation in the 18th century, not as antagonists, not as obstacles to settlement, but as a people with a history, a political structure, a body of knowledge, and a set of legitimate claims that the colonial world was systematically refusing to recognize. The Shawnee were among the most mobile and politically sophisticated native nations in eastern North America. Their history before European contact was one of wide geographic range. They had lived at various times in the Ohio country, in the Southeast, in Pennsylvania, and had maintained trade and alliance networks across enormous distances. By the mid-18th century, pressure from colonial expansion had concentrated them in the Ohio River Valley and the country to the north of it, and they had developed an extraordinary capacity for adaptation to changing circumstances. They were not a monolithic political entity. The Shawnee were organized into 5 divisions: Chillicothe, Thawikila, Mekoche, Pecowe, and Kishpokotha, each with distinct political and ceremonial responsibilities within the broader Shawnee world. Leadership was not simple hereditary autocracy, but a complex negotiation between civil and war chiefs, between the authority of individual division leaders and the broader concerns of the nation. Blackfish was a war chief of the Chillicothe division, operating within this structure, accountable to it, constrained by it. His decision to adopt Boone was not arbitrary personal sentiment. It was an act within a recognized Shawnee cultural framework with specific social meaning. The Shawnee understood what was happening to them with painful clarity. They had been watching colonial expansion for a century. They had been present as allies or enemies or observers at the great diplomatic events that had shaped eastern North America. The Iroquois Confederacy's dominance, the wars between France and Britain, the treaties that had moved boundaries without consulting the people who actually lived at those boundaries. They understood that the Long Hunters coming through the Cumberland Gap were not the threat. The Long Hunters were the symptom. The threat was what came behind the Long Hunters: the settlers, the surveyors, the land companies, the lawyers, and the courts that would take what the Long Hunters had found and turn it into an argument for ownership. Their resistance to the Kentucky settlements was therefore not, as it was consistently framed in colonial accounts, mindless violence or savagery or the irrational hostility of a primitive people toward progress. It was a coherent strategic response by a people who understood correctly that their survival as a nation was at stake, and who used the military and diplomatic tools available to them with considerable skill. The British alliance was part of that strategy, not the whole of it. The Shawnee were not British puppets. They had their own goals, their own timeline, and their own assessment of what the alliance could deliver. They accepted British material support, British advisors, the occasional participation of British Rangers in their operations, because those things were useful. They declined British direction when it conflicted with Shawnee interests. It was a working relationship between parties with overlapping but not identical goals, and the Shawnee navigated it with a sophistication that British commanders sometimes found frustrating. What they could not overcome was arithmetic. The population of the eastern seaboard in the 1770s was growing at a rate that made sustained resistance increasingly impossible. Every year, more settlers came through the gap. Every year, the settlements grew stronger and more numerous. Every year, the military resources available to the Shawnee, limited by the size of their nation, the demands of maintaining their own communities, the difficulty of sustaining long campaigns in the field, were stretched thinner against an opponent whose resources were effectively limitless. Blackfish died in 1779, a year after the siege of Boonesboro, from wounds sustained in a raid on a Kentucky settlement. The historical record is laconic about his end, a brief mention in colonial accounts, the kind of notation that was accorded to a dead enemy rather than to a person. We do not know what he thought in those last months, after Boone's escape, after the failed siege. We do not know whether he understood Boone's departure as betrayal or as the inevitable outcome of a situation that had no good resolution. We do not know whether he remembered, in whatever way dying men remember things, the months when Sheltowee had hunted with his people and eaten at his fire and been called, however briefly, his son. We know that he fought for his people until he was no longer able to. We know that the cause he fought for was lost before he died, though the full scale of that loss would not be apparent for another generation. And we know that the land he died defending was, within a few decades of his death, one of the most densely settled states in the American Republic. The story of the Shawnee in the Revolutionary era is not a side story to Daniel Boone's biography. It is the same story told from the other side of the stockade wall, the specific knowledge that allowed Daniel Boone to operate successfully in the Kentucky wilderness, to survive alone for months, to escape recapture repeatedly, to lead parties through terrain that defeated better-equipped men, deserves careful examination because it illuminates something important, not just about Boone, but about how survival knowledge actually worked on the frontier. Boone was, first and foremost, a tracker of extraordinary skill, not simply in the sense of following footprints, though he could do that in conditions that defeated less experienced men, reading ground disturbed by moccasins or bare feet, estimating the age of a track by the degree to which its edges had dried or collapsed, following sign through terrain where conventional trackers lost the thread. He was a tracker in the deeper, more comprehensive sense of reading landscape as a system. He understood how animals moved through terrain under different weather conditions, where deer would be at dawn, where buffalo would congregate after rain, what the behavior of birds in a particular grove meant about who else had recently passed through. He read the forest the way a musician reads a score. The individual notes mattered less than the pattern they made together. This knowledge had not developed in isolation. The Shawnee hunters with whom he interacted, first as a fugitive moving through their territory, then as an adopted member of their community, were the inheritors of a tradition of woodland knowledge developed over centuries of intimate relationship with this specific landscape. The routes that Boone followed through the Kentucky country, The salt lick locations he knew, the river crossings he used. These were not discoveries in the colonial sense of things no one had previously known. They were features of a landscape that had been known, used, and maintained by native peoples for generations, and what Boone did was learn that existing system of knowledge with the same combination of aptitude and desperation that had made him a superior long hunter. The trails through the Cumberland Gap that became the Wilderness Road were not invented by Boone's axemen. They were native paths, widened. The salt licks that anchored his knowledge of game movement in Kentucky were known to the Shawnee and Cherokee long before any European arrived. The practice of reading weather by cloud formation and animal behavior, of predicting river levels by upstream conditions, of identifying edible plants and safe water sources in unfamiliar terrain. These were components of an indigenous knowledge system that had been developed and refined in this specific environment for far longer than European colonists had been on the continent. Boone's genius was synthesis. He was a superior student of a knowledge system that was not originally his, applied with the practical urgency of a man whose survival depended on getting it right every day. He was also, it should be said, physically extraordinary. The accounts of his endurance, the 160-mile escape from Chillicothe, the extended solo winter in Kentucky, the repeated military campaigns through his 40s and 50s, describe a man whose physical constitution was simply exceptional. He was not large by contemporary accounts. He was lean, quick, and possessed of the kind of stamina that is partly training and partly something that cannot be trained. When he was 64 years old and leading his family across the Mississippi into Missouri, he had already lived a life that would have physically destroyed most men twice over. The practical techniques of frontier survival that Boone mastered are worth understanding in their specifics. Fire management was critical and counterintuitive. In hostile territory, the question was not how to make a fire, but whether to make one at all, and if so, how to make one small enough to cook with, but invisible enough not to advertise your position for miles in every direction. The answer, in the Kentucky wilderness where Shawnee and Cherokee war parties moved with regularity, was often no fire at all, or a fire made from dry hardwood that produced minimal smoke, built in a hollow or behind a ridge that blocked the light and extinguished before dawn. Cold food and cold nights were preferable to a warm camp that became a target. Water discipline was equally important and equally non-obvious. Moving through the Kentucky backcountry in summer, a man working hard could sweat out quantities of water that needed to be replaced regularly, or cognitive function, the most important survival asset, began to fail. Boone knew the spring locations, the creek systems, the places where water could be found even in dry periods, with a precision that came from years of moving through the same terrain under different conditions. He knew which water sources were likely to be watched, which were safe, and how to approach each in a way that minimized exposure. His approach to shelter was similarly pragmatic. On extended solo or small group expeditions, Boone rarely built anything. A permanent shelter was a liability, a fixed location that could be found by people looking for him. He used natural features, rock overhangs, hollow trees large enough to crawl into, the dense cane thickets that grew along Kentucky's streams and provided cover that was nearly impenetrable from the outside. When the weather demanded it, a lean-to of branches and bark could be constructed in less than an hour and abandoned without trace in minutes. The principle was always mobility. The man who moved was harder to find than the man who stayed put. His navigation relied on a combination of celestial observation, terrain reading, and the kind of spatial memory that his years of moving through the same country had developed. He knew the major watersheds, the Kentucky River, the Licking, the Green, the Cumberland, and their tributaries in the way a city dweller knows the street grid of their neighborhood. He could determine his position relative to any major landmark without a compass, using the slope of the land, the direction of water flow, and the position of the sun or stars. He had walked the same valleys in multiple seasons and different light conditions until the landscape was, as close as a physical environment can be, memorized. None of this made him invulnerable. He was captured twice. He was wounded. He lost men he was responsible for. He made decisions that cost lives, including one in 1782 that cost the life of his own son. The Battle of Blue Licks on August 19, 1782, is one of the most painful chapters in Kentucky frontier history, and it is a chapter in which Boone's role is documented in ways that must have haunted him for the remaining 38 years of his life. By the summer of 1782, the formal Revolutionary War in the East was effectively over. Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown the previous October, and peace negotiations were underway in Paris. On the Kentucky frontier, no one had told the war. A large force of British allied Shawnee, Wyandotte, and other warriors had raided Bryan's Station, a settlement near present-day Lexington, with considerable violence, killing several defenders and taking prisoners before withdrawing north. A pursuing force of Kentucky militia assembled almost immediately, driven by the particular rage of men whose neighbors had just been killed and whose friends had been taken. Boone was with the pursuing force. He had become, in the years since the siege of Boonesboro, a figure of considerable military experience and community authority. Major Boone, the man who had saved the settlement, the man who knew the Shawnee better than anyone in Kentucky. When the militia reached the Blue Licks, the salt works on the Licking River that had been the site of his own capture 4 years earlier, Boone looked at the ground ahead and felt something cold in his chest. He could read what the terrain was telling him. The Shawnee force had crossed the river and moved into the broken country beyond, and they had done so without doing what a retreating force usually did, which was to move quickly and put distance between themselves and pursuit. They were moving slowly, and the country ahead, with its ravines and dense cover, was exactly the kind of ground where an ambush became invisible until the moment it was sprung. Boone urged caution. He said explicitly that they should wait for reinforcements, that the ground ahead favored an ambush, that the signs he was reading told him the Shawnee force was larger than it appeared and was not running, but waiting. The accounts of this moment agree on his warning, if not on his exact words. He was overruled. Hugh McGarry, one of the militia officers present, accused those urging caution of cowardice, the worst charge that could be leveled in that context, in that world, and spurred his horse across the river. The rest of the militia followed, because in that moment the social logic of the frontier demanded they follow. To stay on the bank while McGarry charged forward was, in the moral calculus of the men present, to be what McGarry had just called them. The Shawnee had been waiting in the ravines on the north bank of the river. The battle lasted, by most contemporary accounts, approximately 15 minutes. In those 15 minutes, 77 Kentucky militiamen were killed. It was one of the worst defeats suffered by American forces in the entire Revolutionary War. And it happened 11 months after Yorktown. Boone's son, Israel, was among the dead. He was killed in the opening moments of the ambush, close enough to his father that Boone saw it happen, close enough that the accounts of survivors describe Boone carrying Israel's body while fighting his way back to the river. Israel was in his early 20s. He had been born in the Kentucky that his father had opened, and he died defending it. Boone survived. He organized the retreat across the river. The chaos of a routed force, men in the water, men running, the Shawnee pressing from the north bank. with what the surviving accounts describe as the particular controlled competence of a man operating in shock. He got men back, he lost his son. He kept moving because that was what the situation required. He never spoke much about Blue Licks. The historical record preserves almost nothing of his inner life during the months that followed. What it preserves is his continued presence. He kept serving, kept organizing, kept doing the work of frontier defense, even in the aftermath of a disaster for which he bore no tactical responsibility, but in which he had lost something irreplaceable. George Rogers Clark led a punitive expedition into Ohio that fall, striking Shawnee towns in retaliation. Boone participated. The raids accomplished their immediate military objective, disrupting Shawnee capacity for further major operations against the Kentucky settlements. And they accomplished something else as well, something the men participating in them could not have named in those terms. They were among the last significant military actions of the Revolutionary War on the western frontier, and they established a pattern of retaliatory violence against Shawnee civilian communities that would continue in varying forms for another generation. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, ended the Revolutionary War and ceded the entire territory east of the Mississippi to the United States. The Shawnee were not consulted. The British had surrendered territory they claimed sovereignty over without any acknowledgement that the Shawnee, or any other native nation, had sovereignty claims of their own. The Shawnee learned what this meant, not from a treaty document, but from the continued and now accelerating flood of settlers through the Cumberland Gap, from the land surveys that carved their hunting grounds into parcels with names attached, from the courts that enforced those names. Kentucky became a state in 1792. By that point, the population of the territory had grown from the handful of families at Boonesboro and Harrodsburg in 1775 to more than 70,000 people. The Shawnee had been pushed north of the Ohio River. The great buffalo herds that had made the Kentucky meadows look like an African savanna were gone, not depleted, but gone, extirpated in less than 2 decades by the combination of commercial hunting and habitat destruction that followed settlement. The salt licks were farms, the canebrakes were fields. The wilderness that had made Daniel Boone who he was gone. Kentucky was changing faster than anyone had anticipated, and the change was not kind to the man who had opened it. The very success of the settlers Boone had helped bring in was transforming the territory in ways that systematically worked against him. Towns were growing, courts were convening. The legal machinery of an organized state was being assembled, and that machinery required the kind of documentation, precise surveys, recorded deeds, witnessed transactions, that the frontier had never demanded, and that Boone was constitutionally unsuited to provide. He began losing land. The process was not dramatic. It was mundane and grinding, and in many ways more painful than anything the Shawnee had done to him, because the men taking his land were using the law of the country he had helped build. His early land claims in Kentucky had been staked in the manner of the frontier. A man walked a boundary, marked a few trees, described the parcel in rough geographic terms, and filed a claim. This was how it worked before there were surveyors, before there were county clerks, before there was an established legal framework for any of it. When the legal framework arrived, it arrived with standards that frontier claims frequently could not meet. Surveys were challenged. Boundaries were disputed. Men with better lawyers and more precise paperwork won. Boone lost claim after claim. The historical record of his Kentucky land losses is complex. Multiple overlapping disputes, different parcels in different counties, different legal mechanisms producing the same outcome. What is clear in aggregate is that the man who had opened Kentucky for settlement ended his time in Kentucky with almost none of the land he had surveyed, claimed, and believed was rightfully his. He was also deeply in debt to creditors in Virginia and North Carolina, whose loans he had taken out to finance the early settlement years and had never been able to repay. By the mid-1790s, he was done with Kentucky in a way that went beyond simple financial failure. He was done with it the way a man is done with a place that has taken everything from him and given nothing back. He had buried a son in its soil. He had fought for it across nearly 2 decades. He had brought in the settlers whose children were now using his territory's courts to dispossess him. He was 60 years old, in debt, stripped of almost everything, and living in a state that bore his name on its road and had no further use for him. He began looking west. The country across the Mississippi River was, in the 1790s, Spanish Louisiana. Spain had been actively recruiting American settlers for its western territories for years, understanding that population was the most practical defense of frontier borders. Spanish authorities in Upper Louisiana had a standard package to offer: land grants to settlers who would swear loyalty to the Spanish crown, convert nominally to Catholicism, and agree to stay. The terms were more generous than anything available in the settled American states, and the enforcement of the conditions was exactly as strict as you might expect from a colonial government trying to populate a frontier. Which is to say, not very strict at all. Boone's reputation had preceded him across the Mississippi. Whatever the Kentucky land courts thought of his documentation, the Spanish authorities in Upper Louisiana knew exactly who he was. His name had been in print for 15 years, in Filson's narrative and its many reprints, as the symbol of the American frontiersman. They received him accordingly. He crossed the Mississippi in the fall of 1799, at the age of 64, with his extended family and whatever remained of his material possessions after a lifetime of financial reversals. The Spanish lieutenant governor, Charles de Hol de Lassus, granted the Boone family a substantial tract of land in the Femme Osage Creek area of what is today central Missouri. The historical accounts give varying figures for the exact acreage, but the grant was large enough to be meaningful and was accompanied by an appointment of considerable local significance. Boone was named syndic for the Femme Osage district. The syndic was essentially the civil and judicial authority for a frontier district responsible for resolving disputes, maintaining order, and representing the interests of the Spanish government to the settlers and vice versa. It was, in practical terms, the role of a magistrate with frontier conditions, frontier informality, and frontier authority. Boone had never been trained in law. He had spent most of his adult life on the wrong side of legal proceedings, and the Spanish gave him a judge's authority over an entire district. He was, by all accounts that have survived, good at it. The records of his tenure as syndic are fragmentary. This was the Missouri frontier in the first decade of the 19th century, and comprehensive record-keeping was not the primary concern. But what the surviving accounts suggest is a man who applied the same practical, people-reading intelligence to dispute resolution that he had applied to wilderness survival for 40 years. He listened to both sides. He made common-sense determinations. He used his authority with the particular directness of a man who had no patience for procedural maneuvering. The community of American settlers in the Femme Osage district trusted him not because he was formally qualified, but because they had known men like him all their lives and understood what his kind of authority meant. And he hunted. This must be said again, because it illuminates something about who Daniel Boone was that no other detail quite captures. In his late 60s and into his 70s, in Missouri, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren in numbers that suggest a patriarch of almost biblical proportions, he was still making extended hunting trips up the Missouri River, weeks at a time. camping in the manner of his youth. Minimal shelter, minimal fire, moving through the landscape with the attentiveness of a man who had never quite learned any other way to exist. His contemporaries documented these trips with a mixture of admiration and wonder. The old man was still out there, but even Missouri was closing in. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 transferred Spanish Louisiana to the United States, and with it came the American legal system, the American Land Commission process, and all of the documentation requirements that had already stripped Boone of his Kentucky holdings once. The American Land Commissioners arrived in Missouri to review existing Spanish grants, and almost immediately Boone's grant ran into problems. The Spanish had issued the grant informally, as Spanish colonial authorities typically did, particularly for frontier districts. The required settlement conditions had not been fully documented in the manner American law demanded. There were gaps in the paperwork. There were disputes about boundaries. There was the fundamental problem that Spanish colonial land administration had been conducted in Spanish, by Spanish standards, for Spanish purposes, and the American commissioners were applying American legal standards to a system that had not been designed to meet them. Boone's grant was voided. He was nearly 70 years old when this happened. He had lost Kentucky land in courts. He had crossed the Mississippi to escape that legal machinery. He had spent 4 years building a life in a new territory under a different flag. And the flag had changed while he was standing there, and the machinery had followed him across the river. He petitioned Congress. He wrote letters. He made his case as clearly as a man of limited formal education and legendary stubbornness could make it. He had followed the Spanish rules. He had served the territory faithfully as syndic. The grant was legitimate and should be honored. He traveled to Washington. Already in his late 70s, a man whose body had absorbed enough punishment to kill several ordinary men, and made his case in person to legislators who may not have known quite what to do with the most famous frontiersman in America sitting in their offices asking for justice. Congress eventually agreed in 1814, passing a special act that restored 850 acres of his Missouri grant. Not the full grant, a portion. The machinery had taken most of what the Spanish had given him, and Congress gave back a fraction. Boone used a significant portion of what he received to pay old debts. This is documented. He had owed money to men in Kentucky and Virginia for decades. Debts from the settlement years, from the failed land claims, from the accumulation of financial obligations that his life's trajectory had produced. The restored land represented a chance to clear the ledger, and he cleared it. Whatever remained after the creditors was not much, but the ledger was clean. Daniel Boone, at nearly 80 years old, having been dispossessed more thoroughly than almost any man of his era by the legal machinery of the country he had helped to found, chose to use his last significant financial asset to pay what he believed he owed. What you make of that depends on what you value. It is either the act of a man whose sense of personal honor was more important to him than comfort in his old age, or the act of a man who never quite understood how the world worked and whose naivety cost him everything, right to the end. Perhaps it is both simultaneously, which is the most human answer. He died in Nathan Boone's stone house near present-day Defiance, Missouri, on September 26, 1820. He was 85 years old. His last documented extended hunting trip had been in 1817, when he was 82. His wife, Rebecca, had died 7 years before him, in 1813. The historical record does not tell us what he said when she died, or how he managed the years afterward, or what it cost him. We know he continued hunting, visiting grandchildren, receiving the visitors who made pilgrimages to see the famous frontiersman in his old age, and found an old man who was both more ordinary and more interesting than they had expected. He gave an extended interview in his final years to John Mason Peck, a Missouri newspaper editor who later wrote a biography. In that interview, Boone pushed back against some of the more extravagant claims of the Filson narrative. He corrected dates. He disputed specific incidents. He offered some observations about the Shawnee that suggest a man who had been thinking about those months at Chillicothe for 40 years. And he said, in one of the most haunting documented remarks of his later life, that he had never been lost in the woods. "I can't say I was ever lost," he reportedly told Peck, "but I was bewildered once for 3 days." The distinction matters. Lost is not knowing where you are. Bewildered is knowing where you are, but not knowing for a moment how to proceed. Daniel Boone, for 85 years in the most turbulent and consequential period in North American history, knew where he was. He was in the wilderness, at the edge of things, in the space between worlds. He just wasn't always sure what came next. That is perhaps the most honest self-description in the documentary record of the American frontier. The mythology of Daniel Boone was being constructed while he was still alive, and it is worth spending some time with the construction process because it tells us as much about the America that needed the myth as it does about the man at its center. John Filson's 1784 publication, The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky, included as its appendix a first-person narrative supposedly authored by Boone. Filson almost certainly wrote it himself, based on interviews with Boone and filtered through his own considerable literary ambitions. The narrative is stylized, elevated in tone, and shaped by the conventions of 18th-century nature, writing, and romantic philosophy. It is Rousseau's noble savage with a Kentucky address. The Boone of the Filson narrative does not just hunt, he communes with nature. He does not just fight, he faces adversity with philosophical equanimity. He is, in short, a character tailored to what Eastern American and European audiences wanted the frontier hero to be. The book was immediately successful, reprinted multiple times in America and Europe. It reached France. It reached Germany. Lord Byron put a version of Boone in Don Juan. The figure of the American woodsman, shaped almost entirely by Filson's romanticized account, penetrated European romantic literature in ways that had cultural consequences for generations. The noble American frontiersman became a type, a symbol, a shorthand for a particular vision of human possibility in the New World. The actual Daniel Boone received some of the royalties from these editions, not many. His financial situation remained what it had always been. What the Filson narrative and its successors needed, and what they therefore constructed, was a hero who embodied the American frontier mythology in its pure form. The solitary genius of the wilderness, the natural man uncorrupted by civilization, the pioneer whose individual heroism opened the continent for its rightful inheritors. This required certain editorial decisions. The role of native guides and native knowledge in Boone's survival had to be minimized or omitted. The moral complexity of his relationship with Blackfish had to be simplified into a story of captivity and escape. The legal disasters, the debt, the court-martial, the land losses, none of these belonged in the hero's biography, and so they were left out or smoothed over, or mentioned briefly as footnotes to a triumphant narrative that ended with the hero standing at the edge of his creation, proud and vindicated. The 19th century extended and elaborated this myth. James Fenimore Cooper's Natty Bumppo, the Leatherstocking, drew on the Boone mythology directly, and Cooper's enormously popular novels, in turn, fed back into the popular understanding of who Boone was and what he represented. The frontier hero became a cultural fixture, reproduced in paintings, dime novels, stage shows, and eventually films. Always the same essential character: alone, capable, virtuous, white, moving through a landscape that yielded to him because he deserved it. Boone himself seems to have viewed the growing legend with a mixture of rueful amusement and genuine irritation. He is documented as having objected more than once to specific elements of the mythology, particularly the coonskin cap, which he did not wear. He preferred a felt hat, and the inaccuracy bothered him in the way that small inaccuracies bother men who care about precision. The larger distortions he seems to have found harder to articulate, perhaps because correcting them would have required telling a story that the American public was not ready to hear. The America that was building the Boone legend was building it for specific reasons that had nothing to do with historical accuracy and everything to do with national self-understanding. The frontier was, for the young, republic, a crucial element of its identity. The idea that the continent was empty, waiting, destined for civilization, that the movement of settlers westward was not dispossession but discovery, not conquest but improvement, required a hero who embodied those ideas without complication. Boone was that hero, pressed into service whether he wanted to be or not. The uncomfortable truth, the truth that the mythology worked very hard to obscure, was that the continental interior was not empty. It was full of people who had been there for centuries, who had developed sophisticated relationships with the land, who had legitimate claims that European American legal theory did not acknowledge, but that human reality demanded be reckoned with. Every step that Boone took into Kentucky, every road he cut, every settlement he founded, was a step into territory that was already organized, already governed, already home to people who were being displaced by the process that Boone embodied. He knew this. The evidence that he knew it is in the very specificity of his relationship with the Shawnee. You do not adopt the name Big Turtle and spend months in a man's household and learn his language without understanding at some level that the man is not your enemy in any simple sense. You do not describe the Shawnee, as Boone did in his later years, with the respect and specificity of a man who knew them as individuals, without carrying some awareness of what was done to them and what your role in it was. Whether that awareness constituted guilt or regret or something less definable, the historical record cannot tell us. Boone was not a man who wrote extensively about his inner life. What he left us is his documented behavior, and his behavior is complicated in exactly the ways that the mythology refused to allow. He opened Kentucky. That opening displaced and eventually destroyed the Shawnee claim to that territory. He also spent months as a Shawnee, man, as Blackfish's son, as Sheltowee, and whatever he felt during those months was real enough that he named his son after a Shawnee man he had known. These things can both be true. History rarely offers the comfort of a moral ledger that balances cleanly. There is a part of Boone's story that almost no popular account dwells on, and it is the part that, in some ways, reveals the most about who he was. The decade between the end of the Revolutionary War and his departure for Missouri. The 1780s and early 1790s in Kentucky. The years after the fighting stopped and the legal fighting began. The Revolutionary War on the western frontier ended not with a treaty that the settlers celebrated, but with a slow withdrawal of British support for the Shawnee, followed by a period of continued conflict, the Northwest Indian War. That was in many ways more dangerous for American settlers than the Revolutionary period had been. The Battle of St. Clair's defeat in November 1791 was, by casualty count, the worst defeat ever inflicted on the United States Army by native forces. Over 600 American soldiers killed in a single engagement in the Ohio country, more than at any other battle in American history before or since. The full dimensions of that catastrophe are rarely taught in American classrooms because they complicate the narrative of inevitable westward progress considerably. Boone was not at St. Clair's defeat. By 1791, he was in Kentucky, dealing with the legal problems that were consuming what should have been his most comfortable years. But the conflict that produced that battle was the same conflict he had spent 15 years in the middle of, and its scale and ferocity should recalibrate any easy sense of how this story was destined to end. The Northwest Indian War ended with General Anthony Wayne's victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August 1794 and the subsequent Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which ceded most of present-day Ohio to the United States and established a boundary line that was supposed to protect the remaining native territory. Everyone involved knew the boundary would not hold. It did not hold. Within a generation, the Shawnee had been pushed west of the Mississippi, and within 2 generations, through further wars and further treaties and the final catastrophe of Indian removal, they had been pushed to Indian territory in what is now Kansas and Oklahoma. The Kentucky that Boone had opened absorbed all of this as background. It was a state by 1792, growing with the momentum of a place that had been waiting for precisely the kind of people who came through the Cumberland Gap. Ambitious, land-hungry, convinced of their right to be there, and arriving in numbers that made any argument against their presence beside the point. The population grew from a few thousand in 1780 to over 200,000 by 1800. Towns became cities. The river commerce that the geography of Kentucky made possible, the Kentucky River flowing into the Ohio flowing into the Mississippi, connected the interior to the markets of the world, and the state's economy organized itself around that connection with impressive speed. None of this benefited Daniel Boone in material terms. The men who profited most from Kentucky's development were the land speculators, the lawyers, the merchants, men who had come after the frontier was established and who understood how to operate within the legal and commercial systems that frontier establishment made possible. Boone understood forests. He did not understand title, chains and quiet title actions, and the specific procedural requirements of Virginia land law as it applied to military warrants issued before statehood. He understood this about himself by the end. The accounts from his Kentucky years in the late 1780s and early 1790s suggest a man who was not embittered exactly. Bitterness requires a sense that something different was owed, but who recognized with the same clear-eyed practicality he had always applied to the wilderness that he had lost something real and was not going to get it back. He had opened the land. Other men had claimed it. That was how it had gone. His response was to do what he had always done when a place had been taken from him: find somewhere else. The Missouri years deserve more space than most biographies give them because they represent something genuinely interesting in Boone's life. Not a coda, not a declining final chapter, but a kind of late flowering. In Spanish Louisiana, and then in American Missouri. Boone was something he had never quite been in Kentucky. A man whose authority and standing matched his skills and experience in a community that valued what he actually knew rather than what he could document in a courthouse. The Femme Osage Creek district of Upper Louisiana was in 1799 a frontier community in the truest sense. Scattered farms along creek bottoms, a dispersed population of American settlers who had made the same calculation Boone had made. A landscape of oak, hickory, forest, and prairie that had not yet been comprehensively altered by European-American settlement. Boone arrived as a man of 64 with a reputation that preceded him by decades, a skill set that was exactly what the community needed, and, crucially, a willingness to simply be present and useful that was not a performance, but his natural mode of existence. As syndic, his authority was real and was exercised. The surviving records include accounts of disputes he resolved, boundaries he established, and matters of local governance he administered with the direct, unhedged authority of a man who had been making life-or-death decisions since before most of his constituents were born. He was not a formal judge. He was something more useful in that context, a man that everyone trusted to be fair, to listen carefully, and to reach a conclusion that reflected the actual situation rather than the legal technicalities that might be applied to it. He also had time, for the first time in decades, to simply be what he had always been at his core: a hunter, a man in the woods. The Missouri landscape in 1800 was not Kentucky in 1769. It had been inhabited and managed by native peoples for centuries. It had a history and a human geography that preceded European arrival by thousands of years. The Osage Nation, for whom the creek near Boone's farm was named, had been the dominant power in the region for generations, and their presence was not a background detail, but an active political reality that American settlers in the area had to navigate carefully. Boone, with his decades of experience in exactly this kind of situation, was perhaps better equipped to navigate it than most. The accounts suggest he maintained respectful relations with Osage people in the region, though the documentary record on this is thinner than one would wish. The hunting he did in Missouri was not the desperate, sustenance-driven hunting of his Kentucky years. He was not surviving. He was pursuing what had always been for him more than a livelihood, a mode of being, a way of being fully present in the world, a practice that connected him to the particular quality of attention the forest demanded. He ranged further than his age might suggest was wise by the standards of any other man. He went upriver into country that was not yet thoroughly settled, and he hunted it with the same concentration he had brought to Kentucky 40 years before. Visitors who made pilgrimages to see the famous frontiersman in his Missouri years found someone who surprised them. They came expecting the larger-than-life figure of the mythology, and found an old man who was courteous and plain-spoken, who corrected specific inaccuracies in the published accounts of his life with the mild irritation of someone who had been misquoted repeatedly, who spoke about the Shawnee with a specificity and respect that complicated the heroic narrative his guests had brought with them. He was smaller than they expected, usually. He was quieter. He was not what they needed him to be, and he appears to have been entirely uninterested in performing what they needed. He told them the story of being bewildered for 3 days. He told them he had never been lost. He told them about the specific Kentucky rivers and how the limestone geography produced the bluegrass, and why the buffalo had gone to the salt licks in the numbers they had. He told them, apparently, a great deal of practical information about a world that was already ceasing to exist, with the attentiveness of a man who wanted the details preserved accurately, even if the mythology had gotten everything else wrong. There is a final dimension of Daniel Boone's story that the mythology consistently obscures, and it is the dimension that makes him most human and most legible to a modern reader: his relationship with the passage of time. Boone lived 85 years in an era when 40 was old age for a frontier man, when the expectation of life was so much shorter than what he actually experienced that his survival was itself an argument for something, for the particular fitness of his mode of existence, or for luck, or for the grace of a God he appears to have believed in without much theological elaboration. He watched everything he had known change beyond recognition. The Kentucky of his old age would have been unrecognizable to the man who had crossed the Cumberland Gap in 1769. The forest was farms, the salt licks were villages. The canebrake where he had crouched and felt the Shawnee close around him was cornfield. The road he had cut with 30 axemen was a highway carrying thousands of wagons a year. The world he had been the first European to fully know had been replaced, in the span of a single human lifetime, with something entirely different. He had made that replacement possible, and he had watched it happen from the front. Whether he grieved the wilderness he had known, whether some part of him understood that what he had found in 1769 was precisely as extraordinary as it seemed, and precisely as irreplaceable as it proved, the historical record cannot tell us with certainty. What it preserves is the practical consistency of his response to loss and change. He moved, he found new territory, he adapted, he kept going. This is either inspiring or it is something more complicated than inspiring, depending on what you choose to emphasize. The capacity to keep going, to adapt, to find the next wilderness and make it habitable. These are the qualities the mythology celebrated, and they were real qualities. They were also the qualities that made the displacement of native peoples possible. The man who kept going was the man who kept coming, and the man who kept coming was the man who could not be stopped. These things are connected. They cannot be separated into a heroic part and a problematic part and evaluated independently. They are the same thing, seen from different sides of the stockade wall. Daniel Boone spent most of his life on the edge between two worlds, between the wilderness and the civilization that followed him into it, between the Shawnee world he had lived in and the American world he had helped build, between the legal machinery that dispossessed him and the frontier pragmatism that he had always used to navigate around it. He never fully belonged to either world. He was always the man at the threshold, moving between them. That threshold is where American history was made in those decades. Not in the courtrooms or the legislative chambers or the treaty negotiations, though those mattered enormously, but in the specific moment when a man stepped out of a world that had ended and into a world that had not yet begun and kept moving. Boone kept moving for 85 years. He stopped in a stone house in Missouri in the fall of 1820, surrounded by family, in a country that bore almost no resemblance to the one he had been born into. The frontier he had known was closed. The wilderness he had loved was largely gone. The people whose land he had moved through, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the hundreds of nations whose world the American expansion was dismantling, were in the early stages of the dispossessions that would characterize the next half-century of American history. And somewhere in Kentucky, on a beech tree that had since been cut down and carved up for souvenirs, was the inscription he had left in the silence of that first solo winter: D. Boone, Sild A. Bar, a man marking his presence in a wilderness that had not yet decided whether to let him stay. It had let him stay, and everything that followed from that, the settlement, the roads, the farms, the courts, the dispossession, the transformation of a continent, followed from a man crouching in December canebrake, surrounded by Shawnee warriors, and deciding, against all evidence, to come back. What remains of Daniel Boone today is scattered across a wide geography, which is fitting for a man who could never quite stay in one place long enough for it to keep him. In Kentucky, Boonesboro State Park occupies ground near the original settlement site on the Kentucky River. The Fort Boonesboro reconstruction gives visitors a physical sense of the scale of the fortification, though it should be understood as an approximation rather than a replica, as ongoing archaeological and historical research has refined our understanding of what the original settlement actually looked like. The Kentucky Historical Society maintains extensive records of the frontier period, including documents that were unavailable to earlier biographers and have substantially changed the scholarly understanding of who Boone was and what he actually did. The Cumberland Gap National Historical Park preserves the pass itself. some 20,000 acres of the mountain terrain through which Boone led his party in March 1775. The gap is unchanged because mountains do not move on human timescales. You can stand in it. You can feel the ridge rising on both sides, the way the terrain funnels you through this one passage, the way what is behind you disappears as you move forward, and what is ahead opens up gradually. The experience does not require imagination to be affecting. It is simply a place where something enormous happened, and the place still feels it. The wilderness road that Boone and his axemen cut through the Gap and into Kentucky carried an estimated 300,000 people westward between 1775 and 1810. 300,000. Not travelers on an established route, but pioneers making a one-way trip into a life they were building from nothing, carrying everything they owned on pack horses or in wagons, following a road that existed because 30 axemen had spent a brutal month in the spring of 1775 cutting it through the mountains. The road was Boone's most concrete and most consequential legacy, more important in terms of sheer historical impact than any battle he fought or any individual act of wilderness survival. In Missouri, the Daniel Boone Home and Heritage Center at Defiance preserves the stone house built by his son Nathan in the early 1800s, in which Daniel and Rebecca Boone spent their final years. It is a solid, well-built structure, 4 stories of Missouri limestone, nothing ostentatious, the kind of house that says comfort and permanence rather than wealth. It sits on a hill above the Femme Osage Creek Valley, and the view from the upper floors is the kind of view that a man who spent most of his life looking at the horizon would have chosen deliberately. Boone's burial is itself a small mystery that encapsulates something essential about his story. He was originally buried in Missouri, near Marthasville, beside Rebecca. 25 years after his death, in 1845, the state of Kentucky decided that the man who had founded the state belonged in Kentucky, and arrangements were made to disinter his remains and those of Rebecca and transport them to Frankfort for reburial in the state cemetery, with considerable ceremony. Missouri has maintained, periodically ever since, that Kentucky got the wrong bones. The story is not as simple as it might sound. The original burial site had been used by multiple members of the Boone family. The graves were not perfectly documented, and when Kentucky's delegation arrived to exhume the remains in 1845, the local people who guided them to the site may have directed them to the wrong grave. Forensic examination of the Frankfort remains in the 19th century produced inconclusive results. The question has never been definitively resolved. It is perhaps appropriate that even in death, Boone ended up in disputed territory. The broader question of his legacy, what to do with the historical figure, given the full complexity of what we know about him, is one that each generation has answered differently. And the answers reveal as much about the answering generation as they do about Boone. The 19th century wanted a hero without ambiguity. The mythology obliged, producing an image so clean and so useful that it survived well into the 20th century in popular culture, in school textbooks, in the naming of counties and roads and towns across the American interior. Boone County exists in Arkansas, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, Nebraska, West Virginia, and possibly other states depending on when you read this. Booneville, Boone's Creek, Boonesville. The names spread across the continent the way names spread when they represent something a culture wants to claim. The 20th century complicated the mythology, as the 20th century complicated most American mythologies, first by ignoring it more or less entirely in serious scholarship, then by re-examining it through the lens of Native American history and the emerging discipline of colonial studies, then by overcorrecting in ways that replaced The heroic myth, with a critique that was accurate in its indictment, but sometimes lost the specific human being in its prosecution of the larger historical wrong. The 21st century, with the benefit of more rigorously researched biography, particularly John MacFaragher's Daniel Boone, the life and legend of an American pioneer, the most thoroughly documented modern account, is perhaps in a position to see Boone whole. Not as a hero, not as a villain, as a man of enormous specific gifts, operating in a moment of enormous historical consequence, making choices that were constrained by the world he lived in and the person he was, producing outcomes that were both remarkable and terrible, and carrying the weight of those outcomes into an old age that the legend was far too clean to contain. The last thing the historical record gives us of Daniel Boone is the remark to John Mason Peck in those final years in Nathan's stone house. The remark about being bewildered, not lost. Sit with that distinction for a moment. Bewildered comes from a Middle English word for being in the wilderness, lost in the wild. But Boone's use of it is different. He was never lost in the wilderness. He was never in the wild without knowing where he was. He was bewildered in the other sense, confused, disoriented, uncertain of the way forward. Not by the forest, which he always understood, by the world of courts and deeds and legal machinery that had taken everything the forest had given him. The wilderness was the one place where he always knew exactly who he was and what to do. The civilized world that followed him out of the wilderness, that used the road he had cut and then used the courts he could not navigate, was the place that bewildered him. For 3 days, he said, he was bewildered for 3 days. And then he found his way out. He always found his way out. That is Daniel Boone, not the legend. The man who kept finding his way out until he was 85 years old and who died, in the end, in a stone house on a hill above a Missouri Creek valley in a country that had not yet existed when he first crossed the mountains into Kentucky. He had outlasted everything: the Proclamation Line, the Shawnee War, the British Alliance, the Revolution, the court-martial, the land claims, the Spanish Empire, the Louisiana Purchase, the War of 1812. He had outlasted them all, and the wilderness he had loved had outlasted none of them. The dark and bloody ground he had found in 1769 was, by 1820, a settled American state, with roads and courts and towns, and not a single buffalo left between the mountains and the Ohio River. He did not see this as triumph, the accounts suggest. He saw it as what it was, a transformation he had helped make possible with all the grief and pride and moral weight that entailed. He was bewildered for a time, and then he moved on. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Thanks for spending time with Western Pioneer Archives. There is one more thread to pull in Boone's story, and it is the one that most directly confronts the mythology, the question of who actually built the Kentucky frontier and who the historical record has chosen to remember. Boone has a name, he has a biography, he has, depending on your source, dozens or hundreds of biographies stretching from Filson's narrative in 1784 to the present day. But he did not build the Kentucky frontier alone, and the people who built it with him have, in most cases, been reduced to supporting characters in his story, or erased from it entirely. The 30 axemen who cut the Wilderness Road with Boone in March 1775 were real people. Some of them have names in the historical record. Felix Walker left an account of the journey that is one of the primary sources historians use. Others appear only as names in a payroll or a petition or a land claim, and some do not appear at all. The work of cutting a road through the Cumberland Gap, the physical labor of swinging axes for weeks in cold mountain weather, felling trees and clearing brush and building rough log crossings over the streams, was collective work performed by men whose collective contribution made Boone's frontier possible, and whose individual stories the mythology absorbed into the background. The women of the Kentucky settlements are in a similar position. They are present in the accounts, doing documented work, loading weapons during attacks, managing households during sieges, making the decisions that kept families alive in the absence of husbands who were fighting or hunting or dead. Rebecca Boone managed the family homestead through multiple years of her husband's absence with a practicality and toughness that the record confirms without illuminating. She is always in the background of Boone's story, never quite in the center of her own. This was a choice made by Filson, extended by later biographers, reflecting the assumption that the frontier story was primarily a story about men. The enslaved people who were part of the Kentucky settlements from their earliest years are the most completely absent. They are present in the historical record in the most minimal sense: names in inventories, brief references in accounts, the occasional specific mention when their fate intersected with documented events. The frontier of the mythology is a world of free white men making free choices, and the presence of enslaved people in that world, doing labor, building structures, fighting in emergencies, suffering the specific compounded horrors of enslaved life on a violent frontier, complicates that mythology beyond what it can absorb. Richard Henderson's Transylvania Company, the venture that hired Boone and funded, the early Kentucky settlement was built in significant part on the labor of enslaved people. Henderson himself was a slaveholder. The survey parties that mapped Kentucky's land claims were accompanied by enslaved laborers. The settlements that grew up around the early Kentucky stations included enslaved households. The legal system that later stripped Boone of his land claims while protecting the claims of other Kentucky settlers was a system that defined some human beings as property, and the people so defined had no recourse within it. These are not comfortable facts to sit with. They do not fit easily into any existing narrative of the Kentucky frontier, not the heroic mythology, not the straightforward critique. They are simply part of what was there, and any honest accounting of what Boone's Kentucky was must include them. The native peoples of Kentucky, the Shawnee, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and others, have been mentioned throughout this account, and their presence and their loss are woven into every part of it. But it is worth dwelling, in this final reckoning, on the specific human scale of what was lost. The Shawnee Nation that Blackfish led against Boonesboro in 1778 numbered in its entirety probably between 1,500 and 3,000 people, distributed across the towns of the Ohio country. They were farmers as well as hunters, with sophisticated agricultural practices and community structures that had sustained their nation for generations. Their towns, Chillicothe, Piqua, Macachac, and others, were not temporary camps, but established communities with houses, council houses, ceremonial grounds, and the accumulated material culture of a people who had been in these places for a long time. Within 2 generations of Boone's first crossing of the Cumberland Gap, these towns were gone. The Shawnee had been pushed west of the Mississippi by the combined pressure of warfare, disease, treaty-making, and the sheer arithmetic of numbers. The specific communities that Boone had known, the town of Chillicothe, where Blackfish had adopted him, the Ohio River country, where the Shawnee had hunted and governed for centuries, had been absorbed into the expanding United States. This is the consequence of what the mythology calls opening Kentucky. It is accurate to call it opening Kentucky. It is also accurate to call it something else. The full weight of that something else is what the mythology has consistently refused to carry, and what any honest engagement with Daniel Boone's story eventually demands that we pick up. He did not design the system that dispossessed the Shawnee. He was not a policymaker. He was a hunter and a guide and a community leader, making decisions in real time under real pressure, without the luxury of the historical perspective that allows us to see clearly what those decisions added up to. He operated within the moral universe of his time and place, which was a universe that had specific limited ways of seeing who mattered and who had rights and whose claims on the land deserved acknowledgement. But the historical record gives us something that the mythology never allowed. A Daniel Boone who had sat across the fire from Blackfish, who had hunted with Shawnee men, who had learned the language well enough to negotiate in it, who had lived inside the Shawnee world long enough to understand it from the inside. This Boone had more information than the mythology's solitary genius of the wilderness. He knew, in a specific and personal way, what was being lost. The decision to keep coming back anyway, to escape Chillicothe and carry the intelligence of the planned attack to Boonesboro, to continue leading settlers through the Cumberland Gap, to participate in the punitive expeditions against Shawnee towns in the 1780s. These were choices made by a man who knew more than most of his contemporaries about what they cost. That does not make him a villain. It does not make him a hero in the uncomplicated sense the mythology required. It makes him a human being living at the center of one of the most consequential and most morally complex moments in North American history, making choices that were shaped by who he was and what he wanted and what the world he lived in demanded, and carrying the consequences of those choices into an old age that lasted long enough for him to see, to really see, what they had produced. The bewilderment he mentioned to Peck, the 3 days of not knowing how to proceed. He found his way out, he said. He always found his way out. He died, surrounded by family, in a stone house in Missouri in the fall of 1820. The frontier he had opened had been settled. The road he had cut carried wagon trains headed further west toward territories that were themselves already claimed by people who would face the same sequence of events that the Shawnee had faced in Kentucky. The pattern was repeating itself, as patterns do, across a continent whose western edge would not be reached for another generation. Boone had set something in motion in 1769 that was still moving when he died. It has not stopped moving yet. The dark and bloody ground, the name the Shawnee gave it, or the name the colonists said the Shawnee gave it, the etymology is debated among scholars, and the precise meaning in the original Shawnee language has been interpreted various ways. But the name, as it has come down to us, carries something true about Kentucky and about what happened there. It was dark and bloody ground. The buffalo had bled into it. The Shawnee had bled into it. The settlers had bled into it. Daniel Boone's son had bled into it at the Blue Licks, close enough to his father that Boone heard him fall. It was also, and at the same time, the most beautiful country Boone had ever seen. He said so. The accounts of his first sightings of the Kentucky meadows, filtered through Filson's literary language but grounded in something genuine, carry the unmistakable texture of real experience. A man seeing something extraordinary and knowing, even in the moment of seeing it, that he will spend the rest of his life trying to get back to it. He crossed the mountains in 1769, and he spent the next 51 years, in one way or another, trying to get back to what he had found on the other side. He never fully got back. The wilderness moved faster than he could follow it. Every time he reached its edge, it receded. Missouri was the last place it waited for him, and even in Missouri it was already beginning to thin and clear and settle into farms. He died bewildered, perhaps, not lost, but uncertain at the end of the way forward, because the way forward, for the first time in 85 years, was a direction he had not traveled before. He had always found his way out. This time, there was no way out. There was only the stone house on the hill above the Femme Osage Creek, and the long Missouri autumn, and the family gathered around him, and whatever it is that a man thinks about in the last days of a life that lasted longer and contained more than any legend could hold. He was bewildered for a time, and then the forest took him back.